an engineer by training. Ooh, this is good. All right, let's see if I can go back. All right, good. So, so I am an engineer by training, and I work in dynamical systems, in control, and especially applied to complex systems and fluid dynamics. Most of the challenges that I have as an engineer are in blue here. So the things that I'm challenged by are dimensionality reduction. The systems I care about often have millions, if not billions, of degrees of freedom required to simulate these systems in a computer. Reduced order modeling is a challenge, figuring out how these systems evolve in a way that doesn't require supercomputers to simulate. Sparse sensing, estimation, and control. So for example, if I have an Airbus wing or a Boeing wing, and I want to estimate the flow state on that wing, where would I put the fewest number of sensors to estimate the things I care about for control? So those are some examples of the tasks I care about in blue. And the common theme for all of these tasks is that they end up being very challenging optimization problems in pink. So they are challenging because the physics is nonlinear of most of the systems I care about. And the systems are generally multi-scale, whether it's a fluid system, a climate system, a disease system. Usually we have multi-scale dynamics in space and time. And that leads to high-dimensional and non-convex optimization problems. And the point I want to make here is that if we think about machine learning as an emerging set of techniques to build models from data with optimization, we're actually getting really good at solving these challenging optimization problems in pink. So if you think about training a deep neural network, that is a high-dimensional non-convex optimization problem. And again, with enough data and large enough computational resources, we're getting really good at solving these optimization problems in pink, which means that we have some hope of solving these dynamical systems tasks in blue. Okay, good. And why do we believe that we can achieve these tasks with modern optimization? The reason is because patterns exist in your data. So in my field of fluid dynamics, the reason that we think that we can understand and control fluids is because even in these extremely complex systems with, again, these might be too complicated to simulate with a supercomputer, dominant patterns emerge in the data. And that's the same reason that we can study fluid mechanics, but it's also why modern machine learning works, because regardless of the system you're working on, there are patterns in the data that are actionable. We actually wrote a recent review paper on this, how to extract these patterns from physical systems and how to build models based on these patterns. And so what I want to point out is that you can look at this kind of how to use machine learning in the larger framework of dynamical systems and control. And I've talked a lot about fluid mechanics. A lot of the examples I'm going to give are from fluid mechanics. But any dynamical system you're interested in, the same methods I'm going to talk about apply. So I personally work on fluids, but my wife works in computational neuroscience. And we essentially work on the same system. So a turbulent fluid and a network of neurons is not that different. They're both high dimensional. You have 100 billion neurons in your brain. They're nonlinear. There are multi-scale dynamics in space and time. And you may want to model, predict, estimate, and control the system with limited measurements. Okay, that's the same is true for epidemiology, for disease systems. If you want to model the spread of a disease across a continent, that is a high-dimensional, nonlinear, multi-scale problem. And so what I'm going to talk about today, what my lab works on essentially, is using machine learning to directly build models for dynamical systems that we observe from data. And we want our models to be interpretable and generalizable. So we want to get equations, if possible, that we can actually analyze, but using machine learning to get these equations. And sometimes we might bypass the dynamical systems modeling and directly build good controllers through trial and error, through experience, again, through data-driven optimization, which I'm calling machine learning. And the third big thing that my lab works on is learning where to put sensors and actuators to control a complex system. And so this is actually highly bio-inspired. In fact, almost all of the pieces of what my lab works on are inherently inspired by biological systems. So if you look at this moth here, the moth is actually an incredible organism. It can interact and fly in a very complex turbulent flow field. So it can fly even when the air around it is quite turbulent. And it has been shown in experiments that all flying insects, every single one of them, have about 100 strain-sensitive neurons placed around their wings in very specific locations. And these neurons, when the wing bends, the neurons fire and they tell the animal something about how the wing is moving. And so it's also been shown that these moths can react to gusts. If they get hit by a gust of wind when they're flying, they can correct their motion faster than their information can go from their wings to their brain and back to their muscles. So they're faster than that information, which means that these strain-sensitive neurons are being accumulated into a local decision directly in the muscle group. And this is kind of a remarkable property that we as engineers and data scientists would like to be able to mimic. Instead of collecting all of your information into a centralized computation and decision, we might want to have distributed sensing and control from distributed sensors. And so this is proof by existence that you can get very, very advanced, robust control performance with very decentralized, fast local computations. Okay, but most of what I'm going to talk about today is in this world of modeling dynamical systems with data. And so I'm going to actually use relatively simple machine learning techniques to build these dynamical systems models. And we're going to try to make these models as physical as possible. We want to learn things that are like what we learn from physics. So I'm going to start off with an example that we call dominant balance physics. This is really nice work by Jared Callahan, who's a PhD student of mine. And the idea here is that if you analyze a complex physical system that's governed by a partial differential equation, so for example, this is the fluid flow past a wing, this is a boundary layer flow, and this is governed by the Navier-Stokes equations, which is a three-dimensional partial differential equation that governs the conservation of momentum in a fluid. And it's a pretty complicated equation. If you write out all of the terms of this Navier-Stokes equation, there'll be something like 50 or 60 terms in the equation. And what the dominant balance theory says, and this has been around for decades, since the 1950s at least, is that if you look at certain regions of space and time, out of that equation, only a few terms will be active and large and dominant. They'll be balancing each other out, and all of the other terms will be approximately zero. So this is how scientists studied these complex systems before computers. When we knew the equations of motion, but we didn't have computers to simulate them, they would make arguments by hand with pencil and paper to try to figure out where in space certain terms were large and active and other terms were nearly zero. And then they would solve those simplified equations. And so this is actually where many applied math departments grew out of this very advanced applied mathematics analysis for these fluid systems. So what I'm going to show you here is essentially how, with machine learning, we can automate this dominant balance procedure. We can learn these regions where different terms in the equations are active purely from training data. And we're going to warm up on this example. So this is a turbulent boundary layer from the Johns Hopkins Turbulence Database. Now, the first thing you do when you have a turbulent field like that is you might look at something called the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equations. So this is a partial differential equation for the average flow field in the middle of that domain. And you'll notice that there are 6 terms in this partial differential equation, okay? So what you can do is essentially compute each term in this partial differential equation at every point in X and Y in space. And when you do that, this is what the first term of the equation looks like. And here's what all 6 terms of the equation looks like. So immediately you see that that dominant balance idea is starting to come out of this data. So there are regions of space where certain terms are large and active and balancing, and other terms are approximately zero. So you can see regions where the domain is blue or orange and balancing each other, and other regions where the domain is black and the terms are nearly zero. And so what's interesting about this way of representing the data is that for every point in space, for every single spatial location, there are 6 numbers associated with that point for each term in this equation. And so I can take every point and I can plot it in that 6-dimensional equation space given by each of these terms. And so that's what we're doing here. These are essentially 2-dimensional slices of a 6-dimensional equation space, and every white dot is one of our data points in space. So now what we're going to do, again, we want to find dominant balance regions. We want to find regions of space where different physics is active. And so what Jared did, the first thing, is he applied a very simple clustering algorithm, Gaussian mixture model, to break this into different clusters of different kind of like grouping points. And then you'll notice, for example, these red points live on what appears to be a subspace. So the second step is to find a sparse subspace that fits each of these Gaussian clusters for each color. And so when you do that, you actually find that there are these 5 clusters that each live in a subspace with a subset of the different terms of the partial differential equation being active and the other terms being 0. And again, because all of those red points corresponded to a specific location in space, you can take all of the red points and plot them back in physical space, and the same with the blue and the green and the purple. And when you do that, you can replot in your boundary layer all of the points that had the red dominant balance or the blue balance. And you actually learn that there are these regions of different approximate physics in your complex system. So we've actually known this dominant balance for the boundary layer for decades. This is one of the most well-studied problems in classical physics, is the boundary layer, because it's so important for turbo machinery and aircraft and automobiles and things like that. But this is pretty refreshing that purely from the data and the governing equation, if you plot that data in equation space and you do very simple clustering, you can learn just from the data that there are these different regions of approximate physics. And so this is a very interpretable model. It means that we can actually simulate the red region faster by only simulating a subset of the physics. And at the interface of the red and the blue region, we learn that they have 1 term in common and 2 different terms. So we can learn something about non-dimensional numbers that might control this transition. Now, this would be cute if we had only applied this to the boundary layer, but we've applied this to many other systems since then. So the boundary layer was our warm-up problem. We've also applied this to high-energy laser systems, which are, again, very important for industrial applications. And we've learned a lot about where nonlinearities in this system drive the physics and the observed phenomena. We've also applied this to geophysical flows like the Gulf of Mexico, where we can essentially learn that there are these different dominant balances. So in the pink and the orange region, those correspond to different regions where different dominant balance physics are holding in the ocean. And presumably there would be different weather patterns and different kind of temporal patterns to the weather in those different regions. And we've applied this to other systems like neuroscience data. So can you model things like a bursting neuron or a field of neurons in the brain? So this is pretty exciting for us. We are very keen on taking the data that we have and ideally an equation that we have, and then learning from this what the different regions, using this to segment the data into different regions where different subsets of the physics are active. Okay, good. So that's one example of how very, very simple tools for machine learning can give you a tremendous amount of physical insight into a complex system. So this is essentially a clustering algorithm based on physics principles. Okay, so for the next kind of half of my talk, I want to talk about reduced order models. And for you, I'll motivate why we want reduced order models. This is actually an experimental flow field that was measured in a wind tunnel in TU Braunschweig by my collaborator, Richard Zeman. And the idea here is that this gray object is supposed to represent a transport truck that is carrying goods across a country. And the purple and orange wake is the fluid wake behind this transport vehicle. So a tremendous amount of fuel is consumed just to overcome the drag because of this unsteady wake behind these vehicles. And getting better understanding and prediction of these wakes will allow us to design better vehicles and better controllers to minimize the drag. So this could have a huge amount of economic impact if we understand these systems better. But to simulate or to build an experiment to actually understand the wakes behind these vehicles is extremely expensive. If I was going to simulate this on a computer, I would need a supercomputer to be running for weeks, if not months, to really simulate the full turbulent wake. And that's too slow for things like design optimization and real-time control. So I need to figure out what are the key features of this system and distill them down to a very simple model, like this differential equation x dot equals f of x, where x describes only the most important variables of the system, and f of x describes how those variables evolve in time. So this is a problem that we can use machine learning to help solve, is to understand how to pull out the patterns and build models for how those patterns evolve. Now, I teach a lot of classes on machine learning, and students today are almost always very excited about deep learning. And deep learning is exciting. It's one of the most exciting technological advances of our lifetime that has enabled tremendous advances in natural language processing, image classification, things like that. But I want to motivate that when we apply machine learning to physical systems, to systems like aircraft and automobiles, robots, systems where safety is critical, then we also need our machine learning algorithms to be interpretable and generalizable. And so deep neural networks are kind of notoriously uninterpretable, and they sometimes fail at generalizing. And so instead of defining what I mean by interpretable and generalizable, I'll give you an example, which is Newton's second law, F equals ma. This is the kind of model we would love to learn with machine learning. So it's interpretable in the sense that it only has a few terms, F, M, and A. Those terms have units, and we can write them down for a specific problem and communicate what those terms mean. So it's interpretable. And F equals ma is generalizable in the sense that you can learn this law from apples falling on Earth, and it's still true when we land humans on the moon. Okay, that's the ultimate generalizability, is that this model still holds even well outside of where we train the model. Now, I could build a deep neural network that would train on videos of apples falling. And if I gave it 5,000 videos of apples falling, that deep neural network could make new videos of new apples falling that we've never seen before, that would probably fool us humans. But that model is not going to be useful for landing humans on Mars. Okay, so that's what I mean by generalizable. We want the model to still be true well outside of the training data where we train the model. And this has been a principle from Aristotle to Einstein, that the model that captures the essential physics of a situation is the model that is as simple as possible, but no simpler. And in fact, a pretty good working definition of physics is the bit of a model that generalizes. So that's what we want. We want the simplest model possible, but no simpler. And that might give us models that generalize. And so in the mathematical or computational mathematical era, we have two tools at our disposal to get machine learning models that are more interpretable and more generalizable. We want our models to be low dimensional, meaning we want them to be in terms of only a few variables like F, M, and A. And we want them to be sparse. We want a sparse model, as few mechanisms that describe how those low dimensional structures evolve in time. And so that ends up looking a lot like this deep autoencoder picture, where I have a high dimensional state X, that might be my data measurements that I collect in some, maybe I have a video of a system, and that's my measurements X. And I would build an autoencoder to learn a latent space Z, where my dynamics are lower dimensional. And I would learn a differential equation Z dot equals F of Z in that latent space, or Z. And so what I'm going to show is that in the kind of current computational era, those models that we want look a lot like this Lorentz 1963 model. This is almost exactly the kind of model we would want our machine learning algorithm to learn, if possible. So the Lorentz 1963 model was written down to describe this very complicated fluid flow of thermal Rayleigh-Benard convection that was observed in the atmosphere. So this was supposed to describe the chaotic weather patterns observed in the atmosphere when you have the sun heat the ground and it creates these convection cells. And if you look at the differential equation on the right, this model has the two features that we're looking for. It's low dimensional. It's only written in terms of three variables, x, y, and z, which are the amplitudes of three spatial modes describing this fluid. And it's sparse. Out of all of the possible terms that could describe this differential equation on the right, there are only 7 terms active and 5 of them are linear. So it's about the simplest model possible that could describe this data, which is exactly what we want for interpretability and generalizability. So again, what I'm going to show you now is how we can develop with machine learning an automated procedure to learn these kinds of models from this kind of data. And so the real goal is to learn dynamics from data. And I'm going to do this using the sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics. I'll tell you about this algorithm in a minute. So we want to learn either ordinary differential equations, x dot equals f of x, or partial differential equations, partial u of t equals some nonlinear function of u, from observed data, for example, like a trajectory of the Lorentz system. We might learn those differential equations. Or from an observed fluid flow. If I have an experiment of a fluid flow, can I learn the Navier-Stokes equations? And then I'll also show you that from these high-dimensional partial differential equations, we can also write them in terms of a few dominant modes and get differential equations for the amplitudes of those modes. Okay, this lower right equation is a reduced order model for my fluid flow. Okay, this is the kind of model I would like to use to design, to optimize, to control my system. So how do I learn these models purely from data? Okay, so that's this sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics, or SINDY algorithm I'm going to tell you about. And I'm actually going to demonstrate this on the Lorentz 63 model, because that's a good warm-up problem. So assume that we have data from this Lorentz attractor, and we only collect measurements of x, y, and z, and we don't have access to the equations. We believe that equations exist, but we only measure data, and assume that we can approximate the derivatives x dot, y dot, and z dot from that data. Now, the simplest model that I could possibly build would be a linear regression model. That would be what the dynamic mode decomposition does. It would give you a little 3x3 linear model that best fits x dot, y dot, and z dot from that data. But I think we know that a little 3x3 linear model is not complex enough to capture these rich dynamics in this Lorentz system. So that little 3x3 A matrix only has a single fixed point at the origin. It can't capture the chaotic dynamics of the Lorentz system. So instead what we do is we augment our right-hand side with more possible terms that could describe the nonlinear dynamics. So instead of x, y, and z, we add terms like x squared, xy, y squared, in this case all the way up to z to the fifth order polynomials. And notice that all of the terms on the right can be computed from the measurements of x, y, and z. And now the goal is to find the fewest columns of theta that add up to equal x dot, that add up to equal y dot, and that add up to equal z dot. Now, 20 years ago, this would have been a combinatorially hard problem, an NP hard problem that couldn't be solved at scale. But now, finding the sparsest linear combination of a library, there are dozens of commodity algorithms to approximate that solution. So we have our own version where we can find the sparsest combination of theta that equals x dot. And when you do that, when you find this sparse regression solution, you'll notice that the terms that are highlighted in blue and in red and in green correspond exactly to the terms that were in the original equations, even though I didn't have access to them. I only started with data. And so essentially what we're able to do is purely from data, all what we're doing is assuming sparsity of the dynamics. We can learn a differential equation that has the correct form that generated that data. So this is what we call nonlinear system identification. Purely from data, we can learn the dynamics that govern that system. Now we actually have a software package, PyCindy, so it makes it really easy to try this out on your own system. So if you have some data you want to build a dynamical systems model of, you can download this and try this yourself. So since the original Cindy paper, there have been some innovations that are pretty powerful. So I'll tell you about one by Sam Rudy, who is a PhD student working with Nathan Kutz and myself, where he showed that you can use this sparse regression procedure not just to learn ordinary differential equations like Lorentz, but you can learn partial differential equations like the fluid flow equations. So if I have data from a fluid flow, so essentially a movie or a simulation of a fluid flow, I can do the same procedure. I can build a library from measurements of all of the partial derivatives and nonlinear products of partial derivatives of the relevant variables in the flow. And when I apply the same sparse regression technique to fit, in this case, omega is the vorticity. So if I'm trying to find the sparsest combination of terms on the right that equals the time derivative of vorticity, then through that sparse regression procedure, we learn a partial differential equation with only a few terms, with only 5 terms here. And it turns out that the equation we learn is actually the Navier-Stokes fluid flow equation. So if we had observations from an experiment of a fluid flow, we could now learn from that data that the best equation that represents that data is the Navier-Stokes fluid flow equation. Now, of course, you might say, you're just rediscovering something that you've already known. So this is equation rediscovery. We've known about the Navier-Stokes equations for 100 years. But now what we're doing, what my colleagues and my students are doing, is we are applying this procedure to new systems where we don't have equations for the physics. Systems in active matter, where we don't have a good partial differential equation that describes the system. Or systems in plasma physics for fusion reactors, where we only have approximate models. We're able to find models that are more complex or less complex than the industry standards that give us more flexibility when we're designing and building fusion reactors. So that's pretty exciting that we're actually being able to use this for real model discovery at this point. And I'll mention, because these spatial temporal systems like this fluid flow, there is so much data for these systems. Each snapshot in time usually has 1 million measurements. So this is a ton of data. You can often dramatically subsample that data in space and time and still learn partial differential equations from even dramatically subsampled data. Okay, so I want to tell you a bit more about how we use these for scientific discovery in fluid systems. So I'll go to this example here of flow past a cylinder, where we're going to try to build a reduced order model. So this flow past a cylinder, I just showed you that if we tried to learn a partial differential equation, we could learn the Navier-Stokes equations. But that's a relatively expensive equation to simulate. This movie here, each frame of the movie has about 1 million pixels. It's a megapixel flow field, which means that there's 1 million degrees of freedom that I need to keep track of and describe in my system. So what you can do is, through a coordinate transformation, you can essentially learn that there are 3 spatial modes that approximate most of the variance in this data. This is just classical singular value decomposition. And if you write the equations, if you project the system onto those 3 orthogonal modes, you can learn a simple differential equation in terms of the amplitudes of those modes, x dot, y dot, and z dot. This was done 20 years ago by Bernd Nowak and his colleagues. This is when he was at TU Berlin. And so what we're going to do is we're going to measure our system in those x, y, and z coordinates, but assume that we don't know the differential equation. And using our Cindy procedure, we can essentially learn that the most consistent differential equation with the observed data has that form of the differential equation in blue. So again, purely from a movie, from a measurement of the system, we can learn now these differential equations that describe the system. And there's some really important things you can do here. So one is that this is work by Jean-Christophe Loiseau from Paris Tech. If you know some partial physics of your system, like you know that energy is conserved, you can actually enforce that into the sparse regression. So we know that energy is conserved in these fluid systems because the quadratic terms have a skew symmetry. And so when you're doing this sparse regression procedure, you can constrain your regression to enforce that skew symmetry. And it means that our models by construction are guaranteed to conserve energy. So this is a very simple way of baking in physics into our machine learning algorithms, is by kind of enforcing that symmetry in the solution. The other thing I think is really interesting here is that if you allow your model to have higher order nonlinearities, third order, fifth order, seventh order terms, you can essentially account for the truncated energy of your system that you're throwing away by your approximation of these three variables. And so this essentially forms a little closure model. So what I want to show you here is how this performs on the prediction of the drag on these two fluid flows. So what we see in the right column in the white curve is the drag coefficient of these two fluid flows as it evolves in time. And the orange and blue curves are the industry best models before our models. So you can see that they capture kind of the right trends, but they're quantitatively inaccurate. They have the wrong rise time, they overshoot, and they have steady state error. But when we build our sparse nonlinear models, we almost perfectly capture those trends in the data and quantitatively as well. And what's really nice about these sparse models that we have is that by construction, they have only a few terms. So you can actually write them down and manipulate the equations. So this blue equation here is actually what J.C. Loiseau wrote down for that flow past a cylinder that gives you that almost perfect Cindy model. So this is to date the simplest and the most accurate model that's been written down for that fluid flow. So this is the kind of model we would want to use for design, for optimization, for control. Okay. One other thing that I think is kind of important to note is that oftentimes we don't have access to the full state of our system, to the full flow field. Let's say we're thinking about neuroscience. We don't have access to the entire brain state of all of your neurons. We might have a few measurements. And so what we've shown here is that in this fluid flow example, if you assume you can only measure the lift and drag on those three cylinders, but you can't measure the flow field, you can still build dynamical systems models just in terms of those lift and drag states. And you get differential equations for the lift and the drag of those three cylinders. You can see on the bottom row that our low order Cindy model almost perfectly captures the trends of the full order model in yellow. So this is pretty powerful, because this says that even if you have limited measurements of your system, you might be able to build a differential equation model in terms of those limited measurements. Okay, so one last thing I want to tell you is everything I've told you so far has assumed that I'm either measuring the right coordinates. So in the Lorentz system, I assumed I'm measuring X, Y, and Z, which is a big assumption. Or I took the coordinate system that someone else gave me. So for example, Bernd Nowak told me the right coordinate system to model that fluid flow. But in most systems that we really care about, we actually don't know what the good coordinates are ahead of time. We don't know what the right coordinate system to measure ahead of time are. So for example, if I'm measuring the brain with a patch of electrodes, I have no idea if that's the right coordinate system to represent those dynamics. And so autoencoder networks, so this is a neural network representation of an autoencoder where you start with high dimensional data X, you have some informational bottleneck in Z, and you try to reconstruct that high dimensional state X. This is one of the best approaches we have for learning good coordinate systems Z that are low dimensional and that capture the essential features of your high dimensional data. So essentially what we can do is try to combine this autoencoder for coordinate system learning with our sparse model identification procedure to learn the differential equation in the latent space. And the analogy I like to give here is that if we think about astronomy, this is how we used to see the world for hundreds of years, for thousands of years before the modern era. When we looked up at the night sky, this is essentially what we saw. We're the blue dot in the center of everything, and everything revolves around us. And it's very complicated to try to describe these physics in this coordinate system. But when you change your coordinate system to put the sun at the center of the solar system, now the motion of all of the planets becomes much, much simpler and easier to describe in this coordinate system. So my point here is that if you are trying to learn physics like F equals ma, some simple equation, you often have to be in the right coordinate system first. Okay, so that's the idea of this Cindy autoencoder. This is work by Kathleen Champion when she was a PhD student with us. The idea is that often to learn a sparse, interpretable model, you need to learn a good coordinate system into the space where that model can exist. And so this combines the coordinate system learning of a deep autoencoder network with the sparse nonlinear identification of Cindy in the blue latent space Z. Okay, so this is kind of I think, a very powerful architecture for learning both coordinates and dynamics in those coordinates. So if you just have a video stream of some complex system, from that video stream, you can start to learn the good coordinate Z, where you can build effective nonlinear models. Okay, so we've applied this to a lot of systems and fluids. I probably don't have enough time to tell you about all of them. Maybe one of them I'll tell you about is this fusion reactor. This is work by Alan Kaptanoglu. We have three-dimensional time-resolved simulations of a spherical fusion reactor. This is tuned to be the same geometry of a companion experiment that we have. And what Alan was able to do is essentially extract a good set of features, a good set of low-dimensional modes from this high-dimensional data that capture most of the variance. And then he was able to build nonlinear differential equations, sparse nonlinear models, for how the amplitudes of those modes evolved in time. So you can see that his sparse model on the right, this blue curve, almost perfectly matches the observed physics of the high-dimensional system, but it's a very, very fast, efficient model that we can use for real-time estimation, prediction, and control in these actual SphereMac devices. So that's pretty exciting. We've also applied this to stochastic systems. So if you don't have deterministic dynamics, but you have really turbulent stochastic systems, maybe you're looking at the stock market or you're looking at a turbulent fluid, you can not only model the structure in x dot equals f of x, the coherent structures, but you can account for the effect of stochastic forcing in sigma w. So essentially, you can modify the Cindy procedure to learn not only the coherent dynamics, the drift dynamics, but also the diffusion dynamics. And in all of the cases we've looked at, so in the right case, this is real experimental turbulence measurements, we learn a low order differential equation plus this stochastic forcing. Again, this is all very, very simple machine learning. We build a library and we're doing a regression to find coefficients in that library. Okay, so instead of telling you all of these examples of complex fluid systems we've applied this to, which I can kind of walk you through these examples if you're curious, maybe here's a good place for me to stop and see if you have questions, and if there's things you're curious about, we can dive into different subtopics. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you all for the attention, and I'd love to answer any questions you have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. That was a very clear and very exciting talk. I will just open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand, I guess, and I will call on you to ask questions.